Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Jeff is going to be joining a little later. He's on a call right now with the Allied Golf Associations in New Jersey. So I will start things off here. Just a few housekeeping procedures here for this morning's webinar. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat feature in this platform and I will do my best to help you. Please be aware that most of the issues we've had for our past webinars have been due to Wi-Fi connections, so there might only be so much I can do, but I will do my best to help you through it. Let's see. Please remain muted throughout the webinar. That way there won't be any background noise while Alice is presenting. If you do have questions, please use the chat feature for that as well, and I will prompt Alice when necessary. There's one button I'd like you all to avoid hitting during the webinar. It's on your screen. It says present now. Please do not click that, as that will interrupt Alice's presentation. And if anyone has called in today, please send me an email at mfrey@pgahq.com. And I will make sure you get your MSR credits with Sue in the office. We are recording this today, and we finally figured out the issue that we were having with our webinar recordings, so those will hopefully be up very soon. We'll put those on the website very, very soon. Before we get into Clark's opening song here, I just wanted to provide a real quick update on golf as it relates to Pennsylvania and New Jersey golf courses. So as you're all probably aware, golf reopens in Pennsylvania tomorrow, May 1st, and in New Jersey, Saturday the 2nd. New Jersey published or released several policies of how golf courses should operate last night. Those were emailed to you via the email we have on file. If you have any issue, or if you haven't received those will be up on our website very soon. Pennsylvania's order was a little bit more vague, and we're still working to get more information about how this affects golf course operations in Pennsylvania. Until then, we, along with the other allied golf associations in Pennsylvania, released guidelines for Pennsylvania golf courses to follow. They're certainly not mandatory that we provided, but they are strongly suggested. Additionally, the PGA of America just yesterday published their own set of guidelines in 3 phases for reopenings. I would suggest you look at those, as well as they're pretty comprehensive and cover CDC and World Health Organization guidelines as well. We had a question from Roger as far as teaching goes in New Jersey. Unfortunately, since New Jersey didn't publish anything specific about instruction, we're still looking into this, so I don't have any official information for you now. What we have been telling our members is just to be as minimalistic as possible and as cautious as possible, and to cut down on as many touch points as you can, not just to protect you and the facility for liability, but to really protect your staff and customers from getting sick. So if we have more information on that, we're hoping we will send that out to you as soon as we get it. So before we go into Alice, I'm going to pass it over to Clark, as I believe he has a song this morning. Clark.
Yes, I do, and 2 inches of rain expected. It's a dreary day, but we'll try to be a little upbeat with a little George M. Cohan. You're a grand old flag, you're a high flying flag, and forever in peace may you wave. You're the emblem of the land I love, the home of the free and the brave. Every heart beats true for the red, white, and blue, where there's never a boast or brag. And should old acquaintance be forgot, keep your eye on that grand old flag.
Excellent, Clarky. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Clark.
Matt, are you ready for me?
So, Alice.
Matt, I have a question for Matt.
Yeah, I'm just going to give you a little intro here, Alice.
Excuse me one
So,
second, Matt,
if I'm sure you're all aware of who Alice Miller is, but she's had an amazing playing career. She's won 8 times on the LPGA Tour, including the '85 Dinah Shore, a major championship. She's an LPGA and a PGA professional, working at DuPont Country Club, and she serves on the National Rules Committee, so she really knows her stuff. With that, I will pass it over to Alice.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to see if I can get my screen up here. All right, not yet. Here it comes. A little slow internet connection this morning. Okay, are you looking good there, Matt? You got everybody? Can everybody see the screen?
Absolutely.
All right, here we go. We're going to look at 2 rules today, everyone. We're going to look at Rule 3 and Rule 10. And a lot of this is just going to be a review for everyone. It's all stuff that you're probably very familiar with. There might be a couple little nuances that we point out or that I point out along the way. And please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to try to go through it. These are big slide decks, and I'm going to go through them in some cases kind of quickly, just to try to make sure we stay within our time frame. But please, on the chat feature, get a hold of Matt if you have any questions. Rule 3, we've got a couple definitions, our purpose statement that we have with all of our rules, and then 3 parts to this rule. And we're going to look at elements that are common for every competition, and then really delve into match play and stroke play and the differences in those 2 forms of play. Purpose statement, again, this is going to be a little bit redundant, but we're going to cover the 3 central elements of all golf competitions. You're going to either be playing match play or stroke play, so the format is going to be one thing. You're going to play as an individual or a partner as part of a side, and then scoring can either be by gross scores with no handicap or net scores. So those are kind of the 3 things that we're going to cover. Couple quick definitions. Match play, we know that that's a form of play where you're going to play against an opponent or an opposing side, and it's head-to-head. Just you against the other person, and you win the hole by completing it in fewer strokes. And obviously the match is won when a player or side leads by more holes than remain to be played. All pretty much stuff we're familiar with. They're going to take us into a few more definitions here of player, opponent, and side, just as a refresher. Go over this fairly quickly. Interestingly enough, player is not in the definitions. If you look in the back of your rule book, there's no definition for player. I guess it's they just assume you know what it is, but it is used in both match play and stroke play and refers to any golfer. It can be an opponent or a partner, members of a side. An opponent is only used in match play, and that's the person that you're playing against. And we no longer have the specific definition for somebody in stroke play. It's just player. But when you see the word opponent, you know that it's a match play format. A side is 2 or more partners competing as a single unit, and this can be in either match play or stroke play. 2 or more partners competing as a single unit. That'll come into play when we get to our quiz question at the end. Anyway, each set of partners is a side, whether they're playing their own ball and 4-ball or the partners play 1 ball and foursomes. A side is not the same as a team. This is a new distinction in the 2019 code, and we actually have a rule, Rule 24, that talks about team competition, whether that's collegiate, high school, could be, Ryder Cup, those kind of things. Match play can be played as singles, 3-ball, which we don't see very often. Each of these guys playing a match against the other 2. Foursomes, 4-ball, and Jeff's going to cover foursomes and 4-ball next Thursday. Stroke play, it's you against the world, okay? Compete against all the other players in the competition. And this is a little bit redundant, but, it's the total number of strokes, including strokes made by talent. And penalty strokes earned by misfortune, I guess. A little redundant there. And it's whoever does it in the fewest total strokes. That's the winner. And we do have some forms of stroke play that have different scoring methods, and those are covered in Rule 21. These are some fun formats that you probably use at your facilities, but that's just letting us know that there are forms of stroke play with different scoring methods. And stroke play can be individual, or it can involve sides, foursomes and four ball being our most, the ones we see the most. I'm not going to read this list, but I like this slide because it kind of shows the differences. I mean, there's quite a few differences between match play and stroke play. And we are going to dive into some of these as we get into 3.2 and 3.3. But this slide just kind of like, kind of jumps out how many differences there are between the two forms of play. Again, reminding us these are very different forms of play. And the first time I went to a rules workshop, which is many, many moons ago, I remember that first morning, Tom Meeks and I believe, let's see, who was the PG? Tom. Anyway, we spent the better part of the morning going over the differences between match play and stroke play. And as someone who had played mostly stroke play, it was eye-opening to me. But the main thing is that you just have a player and an opponent. They're competing against each other, and it's their own little world. In stroke play, you're competing against everybody else based on total score. Very different. Most of the rules do apply in both forms of play, but there are certain rules that apply only in one or the other, and that's what we're going to look at in 3.2 and 3.3. This is an important little thing to kind of look at. In our committee procedures, it tells the committee if it runs a competition that combines the two forms of play, it gives a couple of recommendations. But I'm just going to say right now, but it starts out by saying that it's discouraged, and I would say that it should be strongly discouraged. Now, you can't help it if one of your members or guests, they walk in and they played both forms of play and they want you to help sort something out. But it used to be the rules didn't even contemplate this. The two forms of play are so different. But we do have some help in our committee procedures if that does happen or you do want to try to do that. And then we have our other forms of play that use a different scoring method. We're not going to worry about those. Just reminding us that all rules 1 through 20 do apply in those forms of play also. Okay, second element, you can play as individual or as partners. Individual players competing on their own, partners competing together as a side. Okay. And we're going to look at foursomes and four ball next week. Jeff's going to go into that. And rules 22 and 23 deal with that, but rules 1 through 20, unless they're modified by 22 and 23, apply. And also for team competitions, will only be modified by Rule 24. That's the Lady Razorbacks, I believe, from Arkansas. And the guy on the right is the assistant coach. I don't know his name. I did have an interesting rule situation with him a couple of years ago at the regional, but I won't go into that now. Here's a little internal definition about what a scratch competition is. It just tells us that gross score is what the scratch competition is. That's something we all know. I do like this slide because this is Johnny Miller's final round. I believe it was at Oakmont when he shot the 63, and cool picture. They've got some cool old scorecard pictures that we're going to see in this presentation. Obviously, no handicap in a scratch competition. We all know handicap competition, the net score is the gross score adjusted for the handicap strokes. And again, one of the great things about golf, we do this, we play with handicaps so that players of different abilities can compete in the fairway and have a great time playing together. All right, so those are the common elements. You're always going to look at if you have a rules question, whether you're trying to, somebody walks up and asks you a rules question or you're taking one of these quizzes, you're going to want to look at those three elements. What is the form of play? Are you playing as an individual or as with a partner? And is it with or without handicap? And then you can make your rulings from there. Match play has a purpose statement, and we're going to go over some of these things that happen in match play, very specific to match play. Concessions and giving information about the number of strokes taken are two of the big keys. And that's because you're just playing against each other on every hole. You can see each other's play. You can protect your own interest. It's just you against the opponent. It's a little bit obvious, but, you know, you do it in fewer strokes than the opponent, or the opponent concedes the hole, or they get the general penalty. That's how you win a hole. Just all refresher for everybody. This is if this is good to kind of go over, just can get a little bit confusing. If the opponent's ball in motion needs to be holed to tie the hole and the ball is deliberately deflected or stopped at a time when there's no reasonable chance it can be holed, you know, like it's rolled by and it's not going to go back, the result of the hole has been decided and the player wins the hole. Okay, so this is our exception under 11.2 about deliberately deflecting, and we had covered that, I don't know, a week or two ago. Just a little reminder there. And tied used to be known as halve. They don't use that quite as much anymore, but you know, you complete it in the same number of strokes. You agree to treat the hole as tied. Will you agree to tie on this hole? Sure. Just a little note here, this is different than a concession, when we're going to get into concessions shortly, but one of the players has to have made a stroke to begin the hole in order to agree to tie it. That's not true when we concede a hole. We can concede a hole even before the hole starts, but if you're going to agree to tie the hole, somebody has to have made a stroke. Just a little nuance there. Again, you win when you lead by more holes than remain to be played, the opponent concedes, or the opponent's disqualified. Okay, pretty straightforward. If a match is tied after the final hole, the match is going to be extended one hole at a time until there's a winner. All, you know, common sense. But I think the little nuance here is that the extended match is a continuation of the same round. It's not a new round. So you could, you know, switch out clubs, for instance, that kind of thing. Just a little bit of a nuance. In stroke play, as we'll see, a playoff is a new round. So that's a subtle but actually kind of a big difference between the two forms of play when it comes to playoffs. And usually the holes in a playoff are going to be extended in the same order as in the round, unless the committee sets a different order. Obviously, the terms of the competition can say that the match will end in a tie rather than be extended. We see that in all of our big, you know, international events, the Solheim Cup, the Ryder Cup, Walker Cup. It's, you know, if you tie, you get half a point. You don't extend the match. All right. When the result is final, this is probably one of the things I would like to emphasize for all of you. The result of the match becomes final in a way stated by the committee, which should be set out in the terms of the competition, such as when the result is recorded. It gives a couple examples, or reported to a person identified by the committee. So we have committee procedures, and you can go and look at those, and it'll kind of give you some examples. But it basically is just saying this with more words and more examples. And I think it's important to set it out when you have, you know, whether you're doing we had a season-long match play event. I think a lot of clubs do. And when is the result final? And you want to have somewhere on your information sheet or your notice to the competitors or whatever you put out, that whether it's okay when you write the result up on the sheet that's on, maybe it's on an easel, or maybe you probably wouldn't have an official scoreboard for something like that. Maybe it's a sheet that's in your shop and the person comes in, and whether the player has to write the result down, or maybe they have to report it to somebody in the shop who then writes it down. We used to put ours up on the bulletin board so that the players could write their name in. So once that name's been written in and reported or recorded, that's final. And as we'll see, and this will also come into play next week when Jeff does Rule 20, when the result is final determines what you can and can't fix. So really strongly encourage everyone to make that clear when you run a match play competition. When will the result be final? Concessions is everybody's favorite topic, sometimes favorite for my members in stroke play also, unfortunately, but concessions are only in match play, obviously, and conceding the next stroke is allowed any time before the opponent's next stroke is made. Okay, you can give that putt anytime. And so I almost feel funny reading this. That's, you know, they've completed the hole with a score that includes the conceded stroke, and anybody can knock the ball away or pick it up. Concession made while the opponent's ball is still in motion after the previous stroke applies to the opponent's next stroke. Makes sense. Unless the ball's holed, and then it doesn't matter that you conceded. That doesn't make any difference. All right, this is, you can concede the opponent's next stroke by deflecting or stopping the opponent's ball in motion, but only if that's done specifically to concede the next stroke, and only when there's no reasonable chance the ball can be holed. This is our Jordan Spieth kind of illustration. We have so many against stopping or deflecting the ball in motion, they need to spell that out. Conceding a hole allowed any time before the hole is completed, including before the players start the hole. This is as opposed to agreeing to have a hole that we mentioned earlier. And you can even, the match can be conceded any time, including before the players start the match. And, you would see this happen if a player's sick or injured or something like that. Pretty unusual otherwise. How to make a concession? A concession is made only when clearly communicated. If you have juniors, boy, you really want to emphasize this to them. It can be done either verbally or by an action, but it has to be very clear, and it has to show that the player's intent was to concede the stroke, the hole, or the match. And it can be by making a gesture. But I tell you, what I've seen in some of the highest level competitions, including the Solheim Cup, players get very casual with their concessions. And just with your young players, just make sure it's clear. It avoids a lot of hard feelings. If the opponent lifts his or her ball in breach of a rule because of a reasonable misunderstanding that the player's statement was or action was a concession, there's no penalty and it must be replaced. I do something, I nod my head or whatever, and Clarkie, thinks that I was conceding his next stroke, when actually I was just nodding my head like, oh, that was a nice putt. If it was a reasonable misunderstanding, there's no penalty, just replace the ball on its original spot. Go ahead and play from there. Here's a little interpretation we have about concession is not valid when a caddy attempts to make a concession. And when we get to Rule 10, we're going to see that this is something that caddies are not allowed to do. Sometimes they try to do it anyway. I've seen that happen. Anyway, that concession is not valid. There's no penalty to the player. And actually, there's no penalty, even though it's not allowed by the caddy, it doesn't have a penalty statement when we get to Rule 10. So it's just, if the opponent takes an action, such as lifting it, that goes back to our reasonable misunderstanding. There'll be no penalty. Just replace it, and the player then makes a concession. And then hopefully that caddy gets corrected pretty quickly. A little nuance here. If the caddy who made the invalid concession thought he or she was entitled to do so, and they went ahead and lifted the opponent's ball or ball marker, that caddy's player would get the penalty if that was, which it most likely would be a breach of 9-4 or 9-5. Real important here, a concession is final and cannot be declined or withdrawn. Okay. The guy saying your putt is good. Whoops, go back to that. Your putt is good. Can the other player that's getting ready to putt go ahead and putt his ball out? He can. There's nothing that prohibits him from doing that. If he putts it and misses, the guy on the right can't say, oh man, that wasn't good. I didn't realize you're a bad putter. No, the concession's final, can't be declined or withdrawn. A real important point. Sometimes, anyway, just remember that. Declaring handicaps, the player and opponent should tell each other their handicaps before the match. Word here, should. You don't have to. Most players, I think, would do this. They would declare their handicap, but you're going to have to declare it at some point. And so when you do declare it, if it's either before or during the match, it could be walking up the first fairway. If you declare a wrong handicap, we have a couple scenarios. If you correct it before they make his or her next stroke, you're fine. You're off the hook. If you come to your senses and correct it, you misspeak and you correct it before the opponent makes their next stroke, you're fine. But if you don't, and the declared handicap is too high, if you're playing at full handicap, you're going to be disqualified. The player's going to be disqualified. If you're playing at a percentage of handicap, which we quite often do, 90% is a common thing we do, and even if it's at 90% and it affects the number of strokes the player gives or gets, you're going to be disqualified. We have our little math thing here. I won't go through it, but essentially, it could have this be where it still affects the number of strokes, and that's the same as the first scenario. But it's possible with the 90% of handicap, once it's figured out, if it doesn't affect how many strokes the player gives or gets, then you're okay. You've avoided disqualification just because you got lucky. I like this interpretation. It just tells you that it's a little bit harsh, but if a player declares a higher handicap before playing the hole that would be affected, you're still disqualified because it could affect the opponent's strategy. And we have an example here. You declare that your handicap is 12 when it's really 11. Handicap is 10 for the other player. As soon as you make a stroke to start the play of the first hole, player A is going to be disqualified because somebody made a stroke in the match with the understanding that A is getting 2 strokes. I mean, you might not get those 2 strokes until the 9th or 10th or 11th hole, but it doesn't matter. It's harsh, but it also, I guess, is intended to keep people honest. Handicap too low, not a problem. Just have to play off the lower handicap. You've done that to yourself and to your own disadvantage, so there's no problem there. This just shows our little handicap table and tells us that in match play, the handicap strokes are given by hole. Stroke play, they're taken off the total score, as we'll see, and that the lower net score wins the hole. Aaron's getting 4 strokes from Zabriskie here. And it just shows where they fall on the card. That's something that's just you have to go over with your beginners and new players. That's very confusing to new golfers. The match is extended. Handicap strokes are given by hole in the same way as the round, again, unless the all-powerful committee decides to set a different way of doing so. I personally don't think that happens too often, but you have that ability. And as we get further into our match play rule here, this is important. Each player is responsible for knowing the holes where he or she gives or gets handicap strokes. This is all up to the player. This is a player responsibility. Okay, and most players are pretty, at least my members have always been very good about getting their card, and you don't have to keep a scorecard in match play, remember, but they usually want to just to see where their handicap strokes fall. And you know what? If players mistakenly apply handicap strokes, the agreed result of the hole stands. It's like, whoa, okay. Unless you correct it in time. Here we have our time frame that we're going to look at for a number of things that can and can't be corrected. And in this case, if you mistakenly apply the handicap strokes, if they correct it before the play of the next hole, or if it's the final hole before that result is announced, before that result maybe is posted on the board, however you've decided to have the result be final. If it's the final hole, you can correct it before then. All the other holes, it has to be before you start the play of the next hole. Otherwise, it just stands. You may have lost out, or you may have, got ahead. Responsibilities of player and opponent. These 4 things are kind of the meat of this rule. And we'll go over these. I mean, they're going to be very familiar to you. Have to tell the opponent about the number of strokes taken. At any time during the play of the hole or after it's completed, the opponent can ask the player for the number of strokes taken. That's to include any penalties that the person's had, and you have to answer. Okay, what do you lie? 2. And when you're asking for that, or when giving it, you must give the right number. If you fail to respond, hey, none of your business. I love that slide. It's treated as giving the wrong number of strokes taken. You're going to get the loss of hole penalty, general penalty, loss of hole, if you give the opponent the wrong number of strokes taken, or you refuse to give them unless you correct it in time. Like we're going to see, I'll explain this a little bit more, but so we have the wrong number of strokes taken while playing a hole and after the hole is completed. While playing a hole, you must give the right number before the opponent makes another stroke or takes a similar action. Similar action being conceding the next stroke or the hole. If it's my turn to play, because I'm away and Clarky asks me, how many strokes have you taken? I can ignore him for a few seconds here while I hit my shot. But before he takes his next stroke, or before he has a chance to concede the hole to me or anything like that, I have to tell him. Usually, you're going to tell the person as soon as they ask you. But there is an interpretation that just lets us know that, okay, it doesn't have to be as soon as I'm asked, but it has to be before the opponent makes another stroke. It has to be timely. They're entitled to know how things stand. After the hole is completed, it has to be before another hole has begun, or, you know, again, the similar action thing. What was your score on this hole? I had a 4. I had a 5 when the player on the left really made a 5. For the final hole of the match, that time constraint is before the result is final. You have that time to correct it. And we do have an exception here. If there's no penalty, if it doesn't affect the result of the hole, that's the best way I can summarize this. So the guy said he has a 4, merely made a 5. The other player had a 7. It doesn't affect the outcome of the hole. I call this the knowledge exception, you know. Nope, I'm sorry, that's a different exception. No common sense. This is a common sense exception. There's no penalty if it doesn't affect the result. Now, what happens if you give them the wrong number and you discover it several holes later? This is a nice little it's an important nuance. You tell them that you had a 4, actually scored a 5 after playing several more holes. Player realizes that he or she gave the wrong number of strokes taken on the first hole. Even though the hole would have been tied if the right number of strokes had been given, the player gets the loss of hole penalty because the mistake affected the understanding of the result of the match. And in this case, you would correct the match score. Okay. We saw a couple of things like applying the handicap strokes in the wrong way. We're going to see about state of the match, where if you agree on it, it's fine. But in this case, that is considered giving the wrong information, and you would adjust. You got to tell the opponent when you get a penalty. When you have a penalty, you must tell the opponent as soon as reasonably possible, taking into account, you know, several factors, how close are they, and other things. Here we have a player, for sake of our discussion, we're going to say that he's testing the sand. He's, you know, seeing how wet or dry the sand is right by his ball, and he's not allowed to do that. And the opponent's up there, you know, marking their ball and really can't see it. So this player needs to tell the opponent that as quickly as possible. And it applies even if he doesn't know. We're hoping that he doesn't know that this is a penalty, the fact that he's doing this. Players are expected to recognize when they've breached a rule. So if you don't know about the penalty, we're going to see a few scenarios. But what's important here, there's an interpretation, as soon as reasonably possible. If you're on opposite sides of the fairway, I think that actually that interpretation might pop up. No, it doesn't do it right here. You know, it's just not practical. You know, I'm over in the right woods and Tom's up there in the farther down the fairway, maybe in the fairway bunker, and I decide to take an unplayable, and he doesn't see me do it, and he's a quick player, so I can't get to him in time to say, oh, Tom, I took an unplayable. That's fine. We'll probably I'll give him that information after he's, you know, as we're walking up to the green. So it doesn't always have to be before the player plays their stroke, but for most cases, it's good to do that. Okay, if you fail to tell them about the penalty, it's just like giving wrong information. You're going to lose the hole. Here's my knowledge exception that I was looking for. Another very common sense exception. If the opponent knew of the penalty, you know, she's standing right there watching this player take penalty relief, then that's fine. You know, you see the person doing that. That person doesn't have to say, oh, I just dropped from the penalty area and took a stroke penalty. So that's our common sense knowledge exception. Knowing the match score. This is a responsibility of both the player and the opponent. They're expected to know the match score. That is whether one of them leads by a certain number of holes or it's tied or so here, guy in the yellow, I'm one up. Guy in that's a white or pink or cream shirt says, yeah, right. Yep. And if they mistakenly agree, they can correct it, just like we can correct other things before they begin play of another hole or before the result is final. But if they don't correct it in that time frame, that stands. That becomes the actual match score. That, you know, I know that, again, that seems, you know, with a stroke play mentality, it's like, oh, we can correct a lot of things and go back and just add it to our card. Well, no, in match play, you can't. That hole's over, and that's the state of the match going forward. The exception here is just common sense. If there has been a ruling request, then you're not going to necessarily know how that match stands. So if it's been timely, Jeff's going to go over that in Rule 20. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole here, but there's a lot of things that go into making a timely request. So that's the exception when you won't necessarily know the match score. Protecting rights and interests. This is the last part of 3.2 here. And players should protect their own rights and interests under the rules. We have 3 different scenarios. If the player knows or believes the opponent has breached a rule, you can act on it or choose to ignore it. That's one of the cool things about match play. You know, you feel sorry for your opponent. Maybe they don't play as much golf or know the rules as well, and you see a breach. You decide, you know what, I'm just going to let that go. You don't say anything. That is fine. Big difference in stroke play, obviously, because we're protecting the field. But in match play, you can be a nice guy or a nice gal. No problem. But what's important to note here, and this has come up in some of our other rules discussions, if they deliberately agree to ignore a breach or a penalty that they know applies, they're both going to get DQ'd. I can't go and say, you know, this, I can't say to this guy, hey, on the last hole, I saw you test the sand. You know, you weren't allowed to do that. And but hey, I didn't say anything, so it's cool. And now now we have a problem. So, you know, if you're going to ignore it, ignore it. But the two of you can't, once the other guy knows and you're deliberately ignoring, then you have a problem. You can't say, we're going to give everything inside the leather. You know, you can't agree. That's a big DQ penalty. And this happens quite often in our, not quite often, but often enough. If the player and opponent disagree, then you can protect your rights by asking for a ruling. And the mechanism to do that is going to be discussed under Rule 20 next week. And there is a mechanism for doing that. And, you know, it's very different than stroke play. I have to remind my members all the time, you know, can't play a second ball in match play. There is a mechanism for asking for a ruling, but no second ball. Okay, that's match play. I'm going to head right into stroke play. Purpose statement, some of this stuff, again, I'm sorry, you guys, it's kind of redundant. I'll try to go through it fairly quickly. I do love this picture of Arnie. Again, just reminding us that stroke play has specific rules. 2 biggest ones are probably about scorecards and holing out, because you're competing against everyone else in the competition, and everyone needs to be treated equally under the rules. After the round, you and your marker, you're going to certify the card just for the holes and return the card to the committee. Okay, this is just part of the purpose statement. We're going to see this in a little bit more detail. The winner is the one who completes all rounds in the fewest total strokes. That includes your talent strokes and your penalty strokes. Handicap competition, the fewest total net strokes. Again, just a reminder here, very important, that the terms of competition should say how ties will be decided. We need to let our players know that ahead of time. Scoring, very different. Scores kept on a scorecard by the marker. We're going to have definitions for these. Okay. Now, you don't need to know that a document, we know that. But isn't this a cool scorecard? Look at that. This is Tom Watson when he won the Open at Pebble. And y'all remember the famous, I mean, just the great shot he hit on 17 when he chipped it in for the 2. He finished birdie to beat Jack Nicklaus by 2 shots. And I just love this scorecard. But anyway, it is the document, but it might not always be a document. It might be electronic at some point. You know, that's coming down the pike where we might have to put our scores, record our scores on an electronic device. So it's any paper or electronic form approved by the committee. It does have to have a place for your score to be entered for each hole, for the player's handicap to be entered if it's a handicap competition, and a place for both the marker and the player to certify the scores, and for the player to certify his or her handicap if it's a handicap competition. And again, just we're used to saying sign the card, so it can be by physical signature, but it's also having us look forward a method of electronic certification approved by the committee. That's coming down the road. Not required in match play, just a reminder. No scorecard required in match play, but most players are going to use one to help them keep track, especially if it's a handicap event. The marker is the person responsible for entering the player's score, okay, and for certifying it. It can be another player, and it just tells us here, not your partner. You cannot have your partner just conveniently keep your score. That's kind of obvious. Committee can identify who will be the player's marker or tell the players how they may choose a marker. You know, the typical way is just have people trade cards. At our PGA championships, we actually the starter will hand each player, we will arrange the cards ahead of time, and we will make sure that which player takes which card. I only once had a player at the KPMG, like Christy Kerr, did not want to be told whose card she was going to take. She wanted to pick. I'm like, I wasn't going to make a scene on the first tee, and it's not in the rules of golf. It's just something we helps us administratively, which I told her that, and she still insisted on picking. So that's the only time I've had that happen. But just switch cards. That's the big deal. Again, just kind of replaying what we had in the previous slides. It can be identified by the committee or chosen by a way approved by the committee. And you must actually use the same marker for the entire round unless the committee approves a change either before or after it happens. And, you know, the committee doesn't have to approve it before it happens. Your player might get sick that's keeping your score, or the person that's your marker might WD or whatever, and then you have to find somebody else to keep your card. And the committee's going to be fine with that after the round. Just don't keep it yourself. That would be a problem. Okay, I'm going to go into some responsibilities here. Marker has 2 responsibilities. Get a score on each box, and then sign off, certify the card. Going to put the gross score in each box on the scorecard. Okay. Now, after each hole, you should confirm. A lot of markers do not do this. They just kind of watch and they know the player made whatever. But it's a good practice, and especially tell your juniors, you know, it's a really good practice just to say to the person that you're marking for, you know, 4, right? And they'll go, yeah, right. Sometimes players go, I was guilty of this, you might go a few holes at a time before I, as the marker, put the scores down. So you better have a good memory if you do that. But so it's a good practice to do it after each hole. And then, of course, when the round's ended, you must certify the whole scores. And if there's more than one marker because somebody got sick, each marker must certify the scores that he or she was the marker for. So you're going to end up with possibly multiple signatures on the card. And the player's responsibility, you know, you should keep your little score too on your little tear-off strip. This is a really cool tear-off strip. This was, I think, Tommy Fleetwood's from Shinnecock when he shot 63. So I went through and added this up, and it was 35 on the front 9. That doesn't sound like a 63 is coming. But through 17 holes, I think he had 25. So I guess he made a 3. Couldn't really read that. I think he made a 3 on 18. But anyway, so whether it's on a tear-off strip, which most tournament cards are going to have, you can take a club scorecard, whatever. You know, keep your own scores. Just most players do that. That's just common sense. Check those hole-by-hole scores. Raise any issues. Make sure that the marker has certified it. You as the player, it's your responsibility to make sure that your marker has signed the card. They use the word certifies, but I'm just going to use the word sign the card since that's what we're familiar with. Can't change a hole score entered by the marker except with the marker's agreement or the committee's approval. I'll go to that in a minute. You wouldn't think this would ever happen. Well, we had a club championship a few years ago, and the player, I don't know, came to our attention that the marker came to me and said, that's not the score he had. You know, I had him for this. And I'd put the scores in the computer and everything. So we went and got the card and we checked it and went and found the player that was involved. And he had changed a score on his scorecard after his marker had signed it, but before he, you know, gave it to the pro shop. And so he was subsequently DQ'd. Whether he was right or wrong in terms of his recollection of the hole didn't matter at that point. This is something that happens a lot, you know, just this, interpretation is just letting us know that as long as it's approved, and you're sitting there and everybody says it's okay, you do not have to initial a change. I don't know, players are paranoid. You know, when you sit in a scoring tent with them, if they do make a change and they erase something and write over it, they initial it just out of habit, but they do not have to do that. Certify the whole scores, promptly return it to the committee, after which the player must not change the scorecard. And again, if the player breaches any of these requirements, you're DQ'd. If you don't have 2 signatures, not a good thing. All right, here's our exception. What happens if your marker fails to carry out their responsibilities? There's no penalty if the committee finds that like maybe the marker leaves without signing the card. That would, you know, in a club event, especially, you know, if we don't have a defined scoring area and the players get together and turn the cards in, and somebody might leave the course and they haven't signed the card. As long as it was beyond the player's control, they're going to give us some guidelines here on what to do if that happens. But that's okay as long as we can get someone to certify it. Wrong score for a hole. This is something we're all familiar with. Return a scorecard with a wrong score for any hole. We have 2 situations. Bad and much worse. If the score was higher than the actual score, or if it was lower, and the return score is higher, the higher return score for that hole stands. I hope you can hear this video.
When Roberto Di Vincenzo finished his final round, he thought he was tied for the lead, but the committee found an error. He had signed for a 4 on the 17th hole rather than the 3 he had made. Sadly, under Rule 6, he had to take the higher score, which left him 1 stroke behind rather than tied with Bob Goldie, the eventual champion.
So boy, that's, you know, he's holding his head in his hand. The good news is he did not get disqualified, but he missed his chance to be in a playoff to win the Masters. That's, I still vaguely remember that, and I was not very old at the time. But here's the worst case scenario. If you return a score lower than the actual score or no score is returned, the player's DQ'd. And this is Jackie Pung, and this is the U.S. Women's Open.
In the final round of the 1957 U.S. Women's Open, Jackie Pung walked off the final green with an apparent victory. But before the competition closed, Pung learned she had mistakenly signed for a 5 instead of a 6 on the 4th hole. According to Rule 6-6, a player who returns a score for any hole lower than actually taken is disqualified. Pung's mistake handed the championship to Betsy Rawls.
How about that? Boy, you talk about heartbreaking. So a couple things there. Ladies, can you imagine trying to play golf in those long skirts? For any ladies that are on this webinar, I crack up when I see that. But that was heartbreaking for Jackie Pung, just a delightful person. It was one of Betsy Rawls' 4 U.S. Open titles, and she was thrilled to win it, but she does not really enjoy talking about the circumstances of how that happened. All right, here we have an exception, and this is relatively new to the rules. This was not this way several years ago. We have an exception. If you fail to include an unknown penalty, if one or more of the player's hole scores are lower than the actual scores because he or she excluded one or more penalty strokes that the player did not know about before returning the scorecard, the player is not disqualified. And instead, if it's before the close of the competition, the committee is going to revise the player's score for that hole by adding the penalty strokes that should have been included. Okay. But we're not going to allow cheating, so this exception does not apply when the excluded penalty is disqualification, or when the player was told that a penalty might apply or was uncertain whether a penalty applied and did not raise this with the committee before returning the scorecard. The player wasn't certain, they weren't sure, maybe it was a penalty, maybe it wasn't. You are obligated to raise that to the committee, and if you don't, you're not going to be entitled to the exception we saw previously where they're just going to adjust your score. So this was a pretty big change in the rules in recent years. Used to be, you didn't know you had a penalty, too bad, you were still down the road. But now you might be okay. Scoring and handicap, big responsibility here. The player has to make sure that his or her handicap is shown on the scorecard. And you can correct it if it's not right. We're going to see if you return it. Once you return it, you can't correct it. If you return a scorecard without the right handicap, the handicap is too high or no handicap is shown. Second scenario, too low. If it's too high or no handicap, and this affects the number of strokes the player gets, the player is disqualified from the handicap competition. And the only time this wouldn't be the case is if it's our scenario where it's a partial, 90% of handicap. You may or may not get it. If it's too low, no penalty. Just have to use that lower handicap. Just a reminder here that the players are not responsible for the math. I tell my members that all the time. Just make sure you get the right gross score in each box, and we will do the math. The committee is responsible for adding up the players' whole scores and also for applying the handicap strokes. And if a player returns a scorecard on which they've made a mistake in adding up the scores, quite often players like to add up their score. Thought I lost my mic there for a second, Matt. Can everybody hear me okay? If if the player does do it and they add it up wrong, there's no penalty for doing that. They're not responsible for the math. I did have a player, again, it was a club championship and it was our defending champ, and they had returned their cards, and after putting them in the computer, the score, I think he had himself down. The scorecard showed even or 1 over, and he was actually 2 over. It was a stroke worse when the computer did the adding. And well, when they checked their cards with each other, we didn't have a formal scoring table. They just checked their cards and turned them in to the shop. And he had gone by the fact that his total score was what he knew it should be, and he didn't carefully check his hole by hole scores. And he had himself for a shot lower than he actually scored. I'm sorry, I said that wrong in the beginning. And I had to give him the bad news that he was disqualified. Now, thankfully, he very classy guy, and he knew the rule, and he was like really mad at himself for not going over his hole by hole. It's like, I knew I had shot, but it happened. So math is up to the committee. All right, going on. Failure hole out. Big difference between match play and stroke play. Have our definition here. When a ball is at rest in the hole or on top of the piece of pool noodle, and part of the ball is in there. I'm just teasing on that, but the ball has to be at rest, and the entire ball has to be below the surface according to our definition. We do have a special case if the ball's resting against the flag stick. We looked at that a couple weeks ago. If any part of the ball is below the surface of the putting green, it is treated as hold. And this was a nice change. It didn't used to be this way. You used to have to go over and kind of wiggle the flag stick and hope it fell in. But under the 2019 code, this ball is hold. Just telling us, Rule 3.3, player must hole out at each hole in a round in stroke play. And if you fail to hole out, you have to correct that mistake before you go on. Or if it's the final hole of the round before you return the scorecard. Have very defined timelines here. So this is one of those must correct or DQ situations. Okay. I'm just going to put the flag in, walk off the green. Hey, Joe, you can't do that. Oh, okay. Nobody, we haven't teed off on the next hole, so I'm going to go back and Joe's going to tap this in. We do have some forms of play where these are, even though these are forms of stroke play, the scoring is very different, and players not disqualified for failure to hole out. And those of you that are familiar with those can understand why. All right, here's our little quiz question. End of Rule 3. Which one of the following is false? Okay, we're looking for the false statement. Player's concession of opponent's next stroke while the opponent's ball is still in motion is valid unless the ball is holed. Okay, I think that's true. We looked at that. Upon completing a hole in their individual match, if the players agree player A is 1 up, when in fact A is 2 up, and the play of the next hole has begun, then the score of the match is 1 up. Yep, we looked at that. That looks true. A side of 2 or more players competing together as partners, except in singles match play and individual stroke play where a side is 1 player. That sounds a little fishy. Boy, the first part of that phrase is just right out of the definition. A side is 2 or more players competing together as partners. But that except part looks a little fishy to me. Let's just check D, even though we think we have our answer. In an individual match without a referee, if a player requests a ruling in time and the committee determines the opponent gets the general penalty, the player is going to win the hole. Yep, that's true. Yep, answer is C. Right, straight from the definition. For those of you that study the rules and take the exams and try to get certified, boy, knowing those definitions is key. Okay, you guys can think of any questions you have about Rule 3 and give those to Matt through the chat, and I will exit us out and get us to Rule 10. Okay, everybody ready for Rule 10? This one is also it'll be very familiar material, has some kind of fun little videos and stuff in it, but it's just a refresher for everyone. We're going to have our purpose statement. We're going to talk about making a stroke, advice and other help, and caddies. 3 main sections here. It's going to tell us how to prepare for and make a stroke, including advice and other help you might get from others. But the main thing in this purpose statement that I like to emphasize is that the underlying principle is that golf is a game of skill and personal challenge. And keep that concept in mind while we go through this rule. We're going to have a definition of a stroke. 10.1, making a stroke, has its own little purpose statement, and talk about fairly striking, anchoring, and some of these things that you can't do. Skip our question for now. Stroke, forward movement of the club made to strike the ball. Wow, that is so cool. I could watch that all day. We're going to get to see Mr. Hogan again. Anyway, it's the forward movement of the club made to strike the ball by definition. There has to be intent.
Here's Beatrice Ricari.
Oh,
What happened? Did she swing and miss?
oh dear.
It sure looked like her real swing.
I think she swung and missed. I don't think I've ever seen
I
that.
don't think I've ever seen that either.
That's her second shot,
That's
right?
wild.
She'll lie too, correct?
Yeah. She didn't pull out of the shot.
No,
She
she clearly slipped.
She slipped.
Yeah, so that was Beatrice Ricari, and her intent was to strike the ball, and her foot slipped, and so that was a stroke. She made a stroke, and Karen Stupples and Kay and whoever the other announcer was, they were quite beside themselves. I've never seen that in golf at that level, but it happened. But a stroke has not been made if the player decides during the downswing not to strike the ball and avoids doing so. We have a couple different full videos here. By deliberately stopping the club head. This is the Tiger's famous check swing. Oop. That's amazing. That hurts me just to watch. But that was not a stroke, okay? Or if you're unable to stop by deliberately missing the ball, Mr. Kevin Na.
On 15, driver in hand, swing and a miss. Now the ruling is if you had no intent to hit the ball in your downswing, there's no stroke, which is what Na said. He had no intent to hit the ball. He called it a check swing. He would par the hole. He is tied with Nick Watney.
So that's not quite the same as Tiger's check swing, but you could see from the replay, he missed the ball by a good 6 or 8 inches. He was deliberately trying to miss the ball. We don't know what goes on in his mind, but that was his prerogative to do that, and that was not a stroke. If you accidentally strike the ball when making a practice swing or while preparing to make a stroke, it's not a stroke. Let's look at Mr. Campbell. I don't know if we have any sound with this one. This is Mike Campbell. He's making a little practice swing there, and he nicks it off the club, and everybody laughs because, maybe his buddies, his guy he's playing with might be giving him a hard time, but there's no problem there. I think I would start taking my practice strokes further from the ball, but that was not a stroke. And this is just a little internal clarification that when the rules refer to playing a ball, it means the same as making a stroke. And in our the player's score, described as number of strokes or strokes taken. Again, just some clarification. Again, Mr. Watson's card from Pebble Beach. Strokes made by talent and any penalty strokes. Purpose of this rule, we have a little purpose statement just for 10.1, and it covers how to make a stroke and several acts that are prohibited in doing so. So there's a stroke, and then there's fairly striking at the ball, and they're not always one and the same. There are a number of ways you can make a stroke that do not qualify, and we're going to look at those. But what we want is we want to fairly strike at the ball with the head of the club, because the fundamental challenge of the game is to be able to direct and control the movement of the entire club by freely swinging it without anchoring it. Anchoring, you can see we're going to look at that later. Player must fairly strike at the ball with the head of the club, such as only momentary contact. Those are all key phrases between the club and the ball. Wow, doesn't mean you have to strike it with that beautiful form, but it'd be nice if we all could. Okay, has to be with the head of the club. Oh, okay. Was that a stroke? Actually, yes, that was a stroke. Did he fairly strike? No. We've all seen this happen. Somebody who's disgusted with their putting walks up and just taps it in with the grip. That is still a stroke, but it is different from fairly striking the ball. Must not push, scrape, or scoop the ball. When you're having putting yips, this is something that you might see a player try to do, one of your members or guests, or rake it back in. That stroke counts. That's a stroke, but it's not fairly striking. Yep, the old scoop. So in all those cases, they were making a stroke, but they were not fairly striking. Here's a nice rules change that came out in 2019. If the player's club accidentally hits the ball more than once, there has been only one stroke and there is no penalty. Here's Mr. Mickelson making a righty swing with an upside down club, and he hits it twice. See it hit off the heel up there? Well, that is no longer a penalty situation, and I have some members that is their favorite rules change. Anybody that's had the chipping yips likes that change. All right, moving on to anchoring. In making a stroke, the player must not anchor the club either directly or indirectly. We can see the player on the left is directly anchoring against his gripping hand and the butt of his putter grip against his body. Player on the right is anchoring his forearm. Okay, this is the typical belly putter. This is when they do it with the hand. Both of those are direct anchoring methods, not allowed. We do have an exception. You can hold the club against a hand or forearm. Both of these are allowed. But indirectly through use of an anchor point. Okay, so yeah, I'm not anchoring my grip and I'm not anchoring my hand, but I've got the forearm against the body so that the gripping hand has now been stabilized, and it creates a stable point around which the other hand may swing the club. That's indirect anchoring. But this just goes on to say that if the club, gripping hand, or forearm merely touches his or her body or clothing during the stroke without being held, there's no breach of this rule. And, you know, Bernard Longer has had people talking for quite a while about this. I'm sure Tom gets questions out there all the time and could elaborate on this further. But just because you're touching the clothing doesn't mean there's a breach. And Bernard Longer's probably one of the most stand-up guys you'd ever want to meet. So when he says he's not doing it, he's not doing it. We do have a little internal definition here for the purpose of this rule. Forearm is the part of the arm below the elbow joint, right there below the crease, and it includes the wrist. Love this old picture of Sam Snead. The player must not make a stroke from a stance with a foot deliberately. Highlighted there, deliberately placed on each side of the line of play or an extension of that line behind the ball. And it has to be deliberate. Okay, with either foot touching. And just telling us that for the purpose of this rule, line of play does not include reasonable distance that is in the definition. And here's our common sense exception. There's no penalty if the stance is taken accidentally, like you didn't realize you were doing it, you weren't deliberately doing it, or if what happens most commonly, you're trying to avoid stepping on another player's line. All right. More fun videos. Unfortunately, we do not have Phil at Shinnecock, but I want you to think of him also. A player must not make a stroke at a moving ball. Here we have Mr. Daly.
Mentioned John Daly's problems at the 8th, where he scored an 11, 7 over par at the par 4. And this apparently was the majority of the problem. He tries to putt from short of the putting surface. Ball starts to run back down the hill, and, well, John decides he's seen enough of that. So obviously he is penalized for hitting a moving ball. And
yep. So he made a stroke at the moving ball, and that stroke counts, and then he's going to get a little reward for that. A little redundant here. Ball is in play is moving when it's not at rest on a spot, but it is good to a good reminder that if the ball is wobbling, sometimes we call that oscillating, it's treated as being at rest and it's not a moving ball. And where I remember having questions about this on the tour was a player, this came into play when the ball is overhanging the edge of the hole and it's kind of moving, or maybe players are worried about being put on the clock for delay of play and it's a windy day and the ball's kind of oscillating a little bit and they're afraid of hitting a moving ball. Well, no, you don't have to worry about that. The ball's treated as being at rest. It's not a moving ball in those situations. We have 3 exceptions when there is no penalty for playing a moving ball. These don't happen very often, but we do have these 3 exceptions. If it begins to move after the player begins their backswing or stroke, that's going to be covered in Rule 9. It may or may not be a penalty. Kind of hard to see. It's not the best video. Making a stroke at a ball falling off a tee. We're going to pretend that that's what happened here. No penalty. If the ball's moving in temporary water or water in a penalty area, you can take a whack at it while it's moving without penalty. Or you can take relief and lift the moving ball. Main thing is not to unreasonably delay play to allow the wind or water to move the ball to a better place. And actually, we had a situation like that up at Hershey Country Club one time with some temporary water. All right, so you're going to get the general penalty, 2 strokes. And just a reminder that the stroke that was made in breach of the rule counts, and you also get the 2 penalty strokes. So if you want to be, a wise guy and billiard stroke it in on the green, that stroke counts and you get the 2 strokes. John Daly or Phil Mickelson doing his John Daly impression at Shinnecock, that stroke at the moving ball counts and you're going to get 2 strokes added on, which to me totally invalidates Phil's argument about why he did that, but we won't go there. We'll do that over a cocktail sometime. Okay, 3 of these acts are strokes that count. Which one is not? Making practice swings, gets a little too close, hits it about 10 feet. Nope, that's okay. We know that that's not a stroke. Whoops, I'm sorry. Went through those too fast. Okay, we know that one's not. Foot slips on the downswing, that was the Beatrice Ricari. That is a stroke. Deliberately anchoring, holding the putter while hitting a putt, that's a stroke. Just because it's not allowed doesn't mean it's not a stroke. And again, the billiard style, that's a stroke. I jumped the gun there on our answer. Okay, any questions on that? Get them to Matt. Otherwise, we're going to move right along. All right, advice and other help. And then 10.3, we're going to get to caddies. But caddies are going to overlap here a little bit. Purpose statement just reminds us that the fundamental challenge for the player is deciding the strategy and the tactics for his or her play. So we are going to limit the advice and help that a player can get during a round. Here's a nice definition. Advice, any verbal comment or action that's intended to influence the player. Choosing the club, making a stroke, deciding how to play. Standing there and commenting on the weather just because you're making small talk, but a verbal comment that's intended to influence, that's a problem, or that's a dice, not necessarily a problem, depends on who gives it to you. This is probably the more important slide. It tells you what advice does not include, and it doesn't include public information. They give us a nice list of certain things that are public information, and anything that's a location of things on the golf course, the hole, the putting green, the fairway, penalty areas, bunkers, the yardage from one point to another, that's not advice. You're playing a new course and you ask the person you're playing with, who might be a member there, like, what's over the hill? Are there bunkers out there? what's the distance to the, you know, that's not advice. And anything that's information on the rules is not advice. And the caveat there is as long as you can give information on the rules, you can't advise the person how to proceed under the rules unless you're their caddy or their partner. During a round, keyword during a round, player must not give advice to anyone in the competition who's playing on the course. Here, Stacy's helping one of her juniors. Ask anyone for advice other than the player's caddy. So maybe Ginger's caddying for Arnie here and helping him read the green. And this is the old classic. You can't touch another player's equipment to learn information that would be advice if you had asked. So I'm going to move the towel to see what club he's hitting. That's the same as asking for advice, and that's a problem. If you get advice from someone other than the player or caddy without asking for it, there's no penalty. This happens in tournaments. I mean, I can't tell you how many times you walk up to a green and the guy that's sitting right by the gallery rope tells you, like, hey, everybody's missed it left, or everybody's left it short. It's like, so that does happen. There's no penalty for that. But if you continue to get it from the same person, you got to try to stop that. And if you don't do so, you're treated as having asked for the advice. Again, common sense, nice interpretation here that helps us figure that out. This prohibition about advice does not apply before a round, while play is stopped, or between rounds. That's common sense. While play is stopped, players are going to sit in the locker room and chat, and so that doesn't apply. Rules 22, 23, and 24 are going to talk about what advice can be given. But we all know that you can always give and get advice from your partner or the partner's caddy. Other help, okay? Caddies are going to be under 10.3, but let's look for other help right now. Uh-oh, hang on, you guys. I got to plug in my computer. Didn't realize my battery was going dead. Didn't realize my computer got unplugged. Hang on. Okay. All right, now I lost my spot. All right, give me a second to find my place. Technical difficulties here, Matt. Hang on.
All good.
All right, let me see if I can scroll down approximately where we were. Right.
You hit that little view slide, view icon down the bottom, all the way at the bottom instead of presentation. Hit the 4 different.
Let me get down. Let me find where I was on advice and other help, Tom, and then I'll start from there. Let's see, right about. Okay, we've seen this guy. We've seen that and that. We've seen Stacy. Now let me just start from here. All right. Close enough. All right. Advice and other help. Pointing out the line of play for a ball anywhere except on the putting green. This is allowed. You can have your caddy or any other person stand on or close to the line of play to show where it is. But that person must move away before the stroke is made. And notice this is anywhere except on the putting green, okay?
See Andrew Warshak trying to figure out what line he's going to take. Obviously, he's got a blind second.
I just want to see, like, stand up there. Yeah, there you go.
This is in line with the flag, so you want to go a little bit right of that.
Okay, I got it. I mean, you need to be
From good friend Jim McGruder.
2 or 3 yards right of that.
Yeah, I got it.
Middle distance here.
I like how he says bite as soon as he hits it. You can't even see it, but he knows he clocked it. Okay. This is going to be the difference here when we get to the putting green. You can have an object set down to show the line of play. as long as it's removed before the stroke is made. But on the putting green, we're going to see there's some differences here. Only the player or his or her caddy may point out the player's line of play, and we do have some limitations. They can touch the putting green. The player, caddy, can touch the putting green with a hand, foot, or anything they're holding, as long as they don't improve the cats. But they cannot set it down. You can't set the object down. So let's go back here. You can point it out. Even if he was holding the water bottle in his hand and he touched the green with the water bottle, he can't set that object down. He have to take it away, of course. That makes sense. But you can't set it down. Even if it's off the green, if that was put there, if that caddy put the water bottle there and said, "Mr. Palmer, please aim at the water bottle," no, you can't. That's not allowed. And unfortunately, this is one that you cannot unring the bell. You cannot undo this. Once you've done it, the penalty has been incurred. Now, while the stroke's being made, the caddy can't deliberately stand. That's common sense, Can't stand close to point out the line of play. They have to move away. Unless they're attending the flag stick. This was new in the new code in 2019, that you can't set an object down to help in taking your stance. You used to be able to set a club down. You can't do that anymore. And once you do it, you cannot unring the bell. Okay, you cannot avoid penalty by backing away from the stance or removing the object. There's certain things that we can restore conditions, but this is not one of them. Okay. Now, this is some new stuff here. And matter of fact, I'm going to get out my little Rules of Golf book and just turn to the appropriate page, because I want you guys, I'm going to have you guys, if you have a rules book, you're going to turn to page 86 here in a minute. Restriction on the caddy standing behind the player. When a player begins taking a stance for the stroke, and until the stroke is made, begins being the key word. We now have a clarification of what begins is, and you'll see as we go through this why this happened. Begins is for the stance of the stroke that's actually made when one foot's in position. Caddy can't be there, okay? This guy's starting to take his stance for the stroke he's actually going to make. And you can't avoid penalty by backing away. However, if you look on page 86, the second bullet point at the bottom, that is no longer, you can just cross that out, just like they've done here. We had this clarification that came out, I believe it was in February of 2019, Tom, right after the tours started playing under the new code. And there were so many instances where this kind of trapped players, because this was one that was very hard and fast. I mean, this was one that you could not unring the bell. Once this happened, the way the rule was written, that player was in a penalty situation, whether they backed off or not. So now this clarification overrides that second bullet point. If you're at the bottom of page 86, you can just cross that out because this clarification overrules that. So there's no penalty now if the player backs away, because by definition they've not begun to take the stance for the stroke that's actually made. And that's probably a good change, because it's that way on the putting green. This applies anywhere on the course. Backing away means that the player's feet or body are no longer in position where helpful guidance on aiming could be given. Okay. Again, this is just a clarification on what it means to begin to take your stance for the stroke, and backing away means that the player has, again, moved far enough away that there could be no helpful guidance given. Now on the putting green, at the bottom of page 86, you can cross that exception out too, because that's no longer needed. This goes on to say not deliberately standing. This is, again, further expands on the idea of common sense. To be deliberate, the caddy has to be aware that the player is beginning to take a stance. for the stroke, and that the caddy has to be aware that they're standing on or close to the extension of the line. And that's what was happening. The caddy wasn't even aware of what was going on in some of the rules violations we had in early 2019. So if the caddy's unaware, the caddy's action isn't deliberate and the rule doesn't apply. Caddy could be raking a bunker. That's one of the examples given here to care for the course. They could be doing that on the extension of the player's line of play and be totally oblivious. Or the player might walk up and tap in the ball before the caddy has a chance to move or is aware that she's doing that. So anyway, real common sense stuff here. Caddy could be getting a yardage is another example. But the caddy was oblivious, that's one thing, but as soon as the caddy becomes aware that the player's begun to take their stance and that he or she, the caddy, is standing on or close to that line, they need to make every effort to get out of the way. You've got to scoot out of the way as quick as you can. This was interesting when the new code was written before, and we were discussing them before 2019. We kind of joked that this was the LPGA rule, because LPGA players were known for having their caddies line them up. And the irony is they had it so drilled into them starting 2019 that they couldn't do this. I don't think there was a single violation on the LPGA tour, but on some of the other tours where these things happened, they realized they were just going to trap players. So they kept the intent of the rule, and that the caddy can't be there when the player's beginning to take a stance in a way that would help them line up. But if it's inadvertent or the player backs out of the shot and starts over, then you're fine. That was a big clarification in early 2019. This one we kind of know, this is familiar. You can't make a stroke while getting physical help from the caddy or another person. Protecting us from rain, maybe put the bag down to block the wind, or stand there to block the wind. Okay, can't do that. You can do it before you make the stroke while you're reading the putt and discussing it, but not while you're doing it. But there's nothing that prohibits a player from protecting themselves from the element while making a stroke. And that's a common one. You might see a player might hold their umbrella over their head while they tap in a short putt, that type of thing. General penalty for 10.2, advice and other help. The big one is the player standing back on the line. That clarification will be, I'm sure, written into the new whenever they do the revision. Caddies, great that they added this to the rules of golf. It really helps clarify what the caddies can and can't do, and that's the purpose. And it talks about what can a caddy do and what they're not allowed to do, and just reminds us the player is responsible for all the caddy's actions during the round, and they're going to get the penalty if the caddy breaches the rules. Skip our question for now. Have our definition of caddy. Again, good to know your definitions. This kind of can help you out when you're taking quizzes. But it's someone who helps a player during the round. And there's two ways they can help. One can be carrying, transporting, or handling the clubs, even if they're not named as the caddy by the player. Okay? If they're carrying your clubs and handling your clubs, they are your caddy. The common sense exception, if somebody is moving your clubs, bag, or cart out of the way as a courtesy, or going and getting a club left behind, they're obviously not your caddy. But otherwise, if they're handling your clubs during the course of the round, they are your caddy. And someone who helps a player during the round by giving advice is the player's caddy. Whether or not they're carrying their clubs, they could be their caddy and give them advice. Caddy may also help the player in other ways allowed by the rules. We're going to see that shortly. Let's get right into 10.3. Players only allowed one caddy at a time to carry clubs, give advice, help in other ways, but there are some limitations. You can't have more than one caddy at any time. And probably the important point here is that you can't change caddies. You can change caddies during a round, but you can't do it temporarily just to get advice from your swing coach. Maybe your swing coach is watching you play, or you're the swing coach watching your player play, and you see something and you substitute in for their caddy for a hole to give them some advice, and then you substitute out. That is not allowed. But otherwise, obviously, you have to be able to change caddies. Caddy might get sick. Caddy might get tired. They might have to go do something else. Maybe you don't like how they're caddying and you want a new caddy. So one at a time can change, but not temporarily for the purpose of getting extra help. Whether or not the person has a caddy, any other person who walks or rides along with the player or carries other things is not the caddy unless they're named by the player, or even if not named, we go back to our definition, they're also carrying and handling the player's clubs. That takes us right back to our definition and our exception about the courtesy of getting clubs out of the way. This is a very common thing. 2 or more players may share a caddy. That's happens at most of our clubs that have caddy programs. And this is just reminding us, this again is, I think, something everybody's familiar with, where there's a rules issue, the action of a shared caddy needs to be decided you decide which player was the action taken for. And if the caddy's action was taken in the specific direction of one of the players, it was taken for that player. And if nobody directed the action, it's treated or taken as the player sharing the caddy whose ball was involved. So if nobody directed the caddy to do something and the caddy did it on their own, the player whose ball is involved was the one you're going to consider for settling a rules issue, deciding a rules issue. The committee can limit, they can adopt a local rule to limit, prohibit, require use of caddies. In the junior championships, they don't allow adults to caddy for the most part, but here we have little sister caddying. So committee has the ability to control that. And you get the general penalty for each holder in which she is helped by more than one caddy at a time. So you can have multiple caddies, and you can do that for multiple holes, and you'll just keep adding 2 shots a hole in stroke play or losing holes in match play for each hole that you do that. So it's a pretty expensive price to pay for having more than one caddy. Reminder that if that happens between holes, the extra caddy or whatever is considered to be helping you for the next hole. Now this is probably the meat of the rule. What are caddies allowed to do and not allowed to do? And we have some nice lists here that will help us kind of summarize things. And the caddy can always take these actions under the rules. They can handle the player's clubs, including driving the cart, moving the trolley, search for the ball. The caddy can search aggressively for the ball. They don't need anybody's authorization to do that. Give it information, advice, and other help before the stroke is made. Care for the course. They're expected to care for the course, smooth the bunkers, repair ball marks, fill divots. And caddy can remove sand and loose soil and repair damage on the putting green. We just talked about ball marks, but they can also, on the putting green, remove sand and loose soil, remove or attend the flag stick. And on the putting green, new for 2019, they can always mark the spot of the player's ball and lift it and replace it. We saw that when we looked at the putting green rule. Clean the player's ball when allowed under the rules. Caddy can remove loose impediments, movable obstructions. Now, if the ball, it's a loose impediment and the ball moves, the player's subject to penalty if it's not on the putting green, but the caddy is allowed to do that. Second category, they have actions they're allowed to do with the player's authorization. Okay, only when the rules allow the player to take with the player's authorization, which must be given specifically each time. Can't give a general blanket statement for the round. But you could authorize your caddy to restore conditions that were worsened after your ball came to rest. Anywhere except on the putting green, you can authorize your caddy to lift your ball. And a rule that requires it to be replaced. Okay, on the putting green, they don't need authorization. That was new in 2019. And here we have a good clarification of, as long as it's reasonable to conclude the player's taking relief, the caddy is treated as being given authorization. Let's watch this. Here the player's going to take relief from the cart path. He's actually put his tee down where he thinks his nearest point of complete relief is, and the caddy, he's not authorized the caddy to lift the ball, but the caddy lifts the ball. And this, that little clarification was just telling us that that's considered to be authorized, and it's obvious what he's doing. So, again, common sense. Now, what are caddies not allowed to do? I think caddies all need to study these rules here. You can't concede the next stroke, hole, or match to the opponent. And you can't agree with the opponent on the match score, okay? All that stuff that happens in match play, that the concessions, agreeing on the score, the player and the opponent have to do that. I've seen caddies that try to concede the next stroke. I don't know why. here again, this goes back to deliberately standing on or close to the extension of the line of play. We covered this in 10.2b. Caddy can't replace a ball unless the caddy lifted it or moved it. All right. And you definitely cannot drop or place a ball on behalf of your player. All right. Player has to drop the ball. Only the player or the player's partner. A caddy is not allowed to decide to take relief. In other words, the caddy can't declare the ball unplayable. The caddy can't decide to take relief from an abnormal course condition. Only the player can do that. Now, they can advise, obviously, but they can't. I've seen caddies advise to the extent that they pretty much did decide for the player, but the player ultimately has to decide to take relief under a rule. Just remind us, the player is responsible for the caddy's action in the breach of the rules, both during the round and while play is stopped, but not before or after a round. Okay. Can't expect you to be in charge of the caddy before or after. And if a caddy's action breaches a rule, the player is going to get the penalty. Or if the caddy's action would breach a rule, if the action was taken by the player, you can't have your caddy doing something that would be a penalty to you if you did it. You can't avoid a penalty, I should say. The player's going to get the penalty under that rule. This is an interesting nuance, and it might be hard to prove this or know this, but when the application of a rule depends on whether the player is aware of certain facts, the player's knowledge is treated as including whatever is known by his or her caddy. Okay, that's just a little nuance. So, if your caddy knew it, the caddy says afterwards, yeah, I knew that was a rules violation, whatever. I mean, the knowledge that the caddy had is also part of it. Just kind of interesting nuance there. It's your knowledge if you were aware, and it's also your knowledge contains your caddy's knowledge. Okay. We're almost done, you guys. Caddies. Which of the following may a caddy do only with the authority of his or her player? So this one should be pretty straightforward. So we have to have authority. Repair damage on the putting green. No, we know the caddy can do that without authority. Mark and lift the player's ball on the putting green. They don't need authority for that as of 2019 code. Smooth bunkers, care for the course. Yep, they can always do that. Restore worsened conditions. And no, I think they need to be authorized for that. Yep, answer is D. That one was pretty straightforward. Any questions on that? So that is Rule 10. And I apologize for rushing through it, you guys. I know those rules are the actual allotted time for the full presentation is to take almost about an hour for Rule 3 and about 55 minutes for Rule 10. But I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think this information, for the most part, was pretty familiar to everybody. Just a nice refresher and kind of maybe highlighting some things that you need to emphasize with your members or your guests during certain competitions or your young players that you're coaching. But most of it is pretty familiar to all of us. If you have any questions, let Matt know. In the meantime, I wish everybody luck as your courses open up and we get back to playing golf, and just would encourage everyone to be safe.
Thank you, Alice. Does anyone have any questions?
Hey, Matt, if I could just add, first of all, Alice, great job, like always, really, really good. But a couple things there that came to my mind as you were presenting. You referenced two clarifications that if you have your official guide, if you're trying to find it in there, you won't find it because that went to print. And these were clarifications that came into effect after the printing of the books. So I think I mentioned this to you early on. If you go on to usga.org, and you go into, the last clarification update was on January 6th, 2020, and there's a PDF file that for all of you at the club, you need to print out at least one copy or have multiple copies, each with your rule book, because they are an extension of the book. You will not find that in your rules book or official guide. So very, very important, especially with that 10.2b stuff. The second clarification is all new, and you're not going to find it in your official guide. So you really need to make sure you have that as part of your rule book. I know what I did is I took the PDF file, I cut and pasted it into a 2-column landscaped Word document, printed it out, and then made a little booklet. So I have one with each of my rule books that I carry with me at home or when I'm traveling. So, but the main thing is to have that as a resource. Don't forget that those new clarifications have changed the positions, particularly the backing away element on 10.2b. The original rule was that you couldn't back away except on the putting green and get out from underneath the penalty, and now you can. So that's just an example which Alice mentioned. So it just made me want to make sure I commented to everybody that clarifications, the new ones, January 6th is the latest update. I'm not sure when they're going to have another one, but please make sure you print that out and keep it with your rule book. It's part of it.
Yeah, great point, Tom, because when I say, and I literally went in my rules of golf book and I crossed out that bullet point and that exception because they're not needed anymore. But when you do that, you better have the clarification handy and know that replaces that language in that rule. But that was a harsh one. It was like, can't unring the bell on the putting green, you can, but elsewhere you can't. And as soon as we got into playing golf, we saw the number of ways that players could get trapped. And so I think it's a good change. There's so many other things that are player friendly that you can undo the damage, and why not that one?
Thanks, Tom. Brian Schulte, are you still on the call?
Hey, Matt, were you trying to call me?
Yeah, I just wanted to check. A question came in about the 2020 hard card. If we generally post that online, and if so, I'll post that today.
We haven't before, but I think it's a good idea to post that online for sure.
Okay, Adam, we'll get that up soon.
Yeah, just a quick point on that, Matt. That's a good. I'm glad that came in. When we updated it for this year, I think we please, for those of you at the club level, make sure you look at it, because there are some things on there that I think we would recommend that you include on your hard card at your club. For example, the back on the line relief local rule, for replacing a club that's broken or significantly damaged. Those two are an absolute must, in my view, for your members and your customers. Another thing too is the relief on the opposite side of red penalty areas. The language on that is important. You want to look at your facility and then also add on your notice any penalty areas where you might give that additional option. And same thing with integral objects, making sure that you've got gates or bunker liners covered on your hard card at your club. How are you going to treat those items at your club? And so if you access the section hard card, all that information is consistent with PGA of America and the association's hard card, as well as the tours are using a lot of this language too. So just a point of interest on the section hard card. Maybe we could even email that out, Brian. What do you think?
Yeah, I have no problem with that at all either.
Great. We will do that. Any other questions? Okay. Before we go, just a couple of reminders. We do have a few more webinars scheduled over the next week. I realize that you guys are going to be a little busier with golf courses opening up, but if you have limited staff and some of your assistants aren't working full time yet or what have you, we will still be having our fitness webinar on Monday at 3 p.m. We have a branding discussion with Michael Breed on Tuesday at 3 p.m. And then the last rules webinar we have on the schedule at the moment is next Thursday, the 7th at 9. So with that, I'd like to thank Alice again for her time and her presentation. It was very good and very informative. And we wish you all the best this weekend, everybody. And please stay healthy and stay safe. And if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself, Jeff, or any of the section staff.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for organizing all these.
Our pleasure.